It's my pleasure today to welcome Russ Lea from Neon. And if I grab from their page on the web, it says that
I could introduce myself if you want.
you got a bachelor's from the University of Washington. Yay!
Go Huskies.
I'm one of them. He actually has a unique story that he can tell you afterwards of getting two PhDs, one from Syracuse University and one from the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry.
Right.
ESF. Let's see. I didn't quite follow all of this. You then became a professor of forestry. Maybe there's some stuff in the middle.
Not much.
It says that you founded the Society of Ecological Restoration.
One of the founders, yeah.
One of the founders. And then you decided that you didn't want to you wanted to organize or manage or something. So you went from Associate Vice Chancellor for Research at NC, North Carolina State University, to Vice President for Research at the University of North Carolina, to Vice President of Research for the University of South Alabama, nicknamed USA. And I guess that's what led you to be now the Chief Executive Officer at Neon. So,
right.
Thank you, Russ.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me here. I'm supposed to stand here so people can see me, I guess, on the camera. So a little bit of embellishment about what happened career-wise. So I think you should always sort of put a career map together for somebody. So that was sort of the highlights. So when I finished up my PhDs at Syracuse, my wife insisted that we go someplace warm. And so I took a postdoc down at NC State. That was a Weyerhaeuser fellowship. In those days, industry actually cared about science and some of the things that were related to the environment. And so Weyerhaeuser sponsored my fellowship, and it was basically on how to grow pine trees bigger, faster, and cheaper. And so my training was in forest nutrition, and they wanted to apply what we learned to their pine forests in the southeast. So eventually, I led a cooperative, which was cooperative in those days meant that forest industry would kick in dues, and you would carry on a research agenda that they would set every year. And so you would essentially send an invoice out to forest industry, and they would ship the money back, and then they would determine the objectives that you worked on. And so in those days, NC State was carte blanche research. I mean, you got to work on what you wanted to work on, and there was sufficient funds to do whatever you wanted to do. I mean, the good old days. And so my career just happened to overlap with the good old days when there were forest industries, more than 3 of them, and there was dozens and dozens and dozens, and many of the names that would have rolled off your tongue back in the early 80s don't even exist anymore. They're all gone. They've all been bought up, and they all exist as land management or real estate-based corporations. And so I went through all the ranks at NC State to full professor, actually now a professor emeritus at NC State, became their research officer at NC State. And in 2000, I was tapped to go to the system office. So that's the UNC system, which is over 16 universities with about $1 billion budget. And so you can imagine at the end of the dot-com era in 2000, then everything, at least in the research triangle area, and everything that related to North Carolina was biotechnology, biotechnology, biotechnology. So it was all about genomics. It was all about the genomics revolution and coming and using all that IT expertise that was built in that region in the South to apply it to genomic sciences and biotechnology. So I lived and breathed biotechnology, and the objective was to take North Carolina to number 3 and kick Maryland out as number 2. So that was my wake-up call every morning, was to kick Maryland out from being the number 3 R&D spenders on biotech and make sure that it was North Carolina, and we did that. So in 2007, believe it or not, I retired from the UNC system with my 30-year pin and became a free agent. And what do you do when you've been a vice president of research for 16 campuses, about $1 billion budget, and you say, hey, I'm a free agent? And so something has to be pretty attractive to call your attention to doing something else. And I really wanted my nights and weekends free, so I really didn't want to be a president of a university yet. That's always sort of in the back of your mind. And so there were several challenges out there and several opportunities for jobs. And one of the really, really cool jobs was at South Alabama, which was forming a cancer institute from scratch, which meant the entire clinical aspects of the Cancer Institute, the entire R&D parts of a Cancer Institute, and build that from the ground up. Brand new building, brand new facilities, clinical staff, physicians, and researchers, and put all that together in one building and design something that's absolutely uniquely different. And I couldn't turn that down. Being a forester, and I have the opportunity to have a hand in creating something from new cloth, which was a Cancer Institute, and anybody who gets to be my age with lots of wrinkles and gray hair knows of the people that you love that you've lost to cancer over the years. And so that was just something I couldn't pass up. And so I decided to take the job at South Alabama. And it was one of the most rewarding experiences, which was constructing this Cancer Institute and having a hand in developing the research aspects of that clinical-based facility. And then just about the time that was all coming together, which was the Mitchell Cancer Research Institute, you can go online and find that, just about the time that was all getting nicely on a rail, this little thing called the BP oil spill happened in the Gulf. And then it was Molly bar the door, right? So I was off and running doing what I normally do, which is putting large research teams together to answer large research questions. The big research question was, what the hell's going on in the Gulf, and what is this oil spill going to do to the Gulf? And so that's how I spent the latter part of my career at South Alabama, was all things oil. And then built a couple facilities on earmarks that we got from Senator Shelby, our Alabama senator, that could just touch his finger and presto kino, out of his finger came $40 million spurts of buildings whenever he wanted to spurt a $40 million burst of funds. And so some of the last earmarks that Congress made were through Senator Shelby, and I got a $40 million engineering building at South Alabama. So that was a good day's worth of work. We got another $40 million facility. So that's how I ended my career at South Alabama and came to NEON for the challenge of it being NEON. So a not-for-profit institute, NEON, formed from whole cloth, not like UCAR being formed from a consortium of institutions and universities and well-meaning entities that want an organization established to handle a big research agenda. NSF Bio decided to create NEON, and a lot of you in the room had a hand in that, out of whole cloth. So how do you stand up a corporation out of whole cloth, and then what is that corporation going to do relative to managing a $434 million project? So when I showed up in 2012, March 2012, we were about 100, maybe 160 people. So today we're over 400 full-time people. With the summer people that are on board, we're north of 500 people. So in a 2-year time frame, we went from about 160 to 400 full-time people. So that's the level of acceleration that this project has. And that doesn't come easy, right? That's a big hiring campaign. That's onboarding a lot of people with them trying to have the training and the understanding of what they're trying to build. So that's where NEON is today. We're about a third of the way through our construction schedule. We're going through a large annual review, a large bottoms-up review on August 25th, and hopefully we come through that with flying colors so that we can get to the end of the project, which is scaled to be completed in 2017, at the end of fiscal year 2017. In the meantime, we're supposed to initiate operations. We don't have our operational award yet, and we should be looking at initiating operations sometime the end of summer, and that'll be a 3-year operational award to determine the best way to organize operations at NEON, and that'll be a $111 million award for 3 years to initiate operations. And then after that 3-year award will come a 5-year award, and at the end of that 5-year award, then the entire project will be recompeted. So anybody from UCAR to Raytheon to Beltline Band that could say, we can do that better than NEON Inc., and you ought to give the project to us. And the entire NEON Inc. Project, as far as NEON goes, operations will be recompeted, just like NCAR's recompeted. So we'll be in that same process, and I do that on a frequency of about every 15 years or so. So at the end of our first 5-year award, we'll be recompeted. So that's sort of the time scale for NEON. So end of 2017, the civil construction should be done. Operations at the end of sort of a 3-year trial period gets the 5-year award, and then a recompete. So part of the charge I had today was to talk about where we might be able to collaborate between our mutual interests and some of our collaborators that you collaborate with and we collaborate with. So I focused on this collaborative opportunities that they recreate, and I had a lot of help with this presentation from Hank Loescher, who part of this presentation was just recently presented abroad at a conference that he went to. So I used this to sort of baseline an idea where we might collaborate. So you know the headlines, everything from sustainability effects to global warming to CO2 to social science interactions with observatories, alternative energy, et cetera, and everybody's got a chart and everybody's got a diagram, whether it's the increase in nitrogen deposition across the United States, with a picture in 2011. Excuse me, my finger's clicking through this. The old CO2 increase to significant loss in species diversity and a downward trend that we're experiencing through time, either with low diversity regions or high diversity regions. They're both experiencing significant loss. To the number of invasive species, alien species, if you will, that we're seeing come across our terrestrial environment in the U.S. And so whether you're talking about primate producers, invertebrates, and vertebrates, that's the 3 different color lines, there's a sense that invasive species are either responding to change or somehow are providing them a foothold in the environment. And this is not such a great slide, but it's shows the change of just around the Washington, D.C. area of urbanization and how rapidly that has spread from nothing pretty much in 1800 to anybody who's been in rush hour traffic in Washington, D.C. has a pretty clear understanding that it's essentially Baltimore or even New Jersey all the way down to Richmond, Virginia. And so it's this entire corridor that's been developed. To other things that you guys are active in, which is wildfires and the intensity of the wildfires and the frequency that are becoming more common. So the headlines can be viewed in some part in a, well, that's just what's going on at this point in time. We live on a planet Earth that's experienced these kinds of changes in the past. Or we can talk about a paradigm of cause and effect. And so that's really how NEON was established in its grand challenges. It was to measure cause and effect of what potentially is causing the change and then what happens when the change occurs and what those feedback loops might be. And so that's really how the bio division stood up NEON on a grand challenge, was essentially based on cause and effect and the feedback and what are the mechanisms behind that. So whether we're talking about climate disruption, more and faster since humans became a species, obviously, extinctions and why they're happening so fast, wholesale loss of diverse ecosystems, we already talked about that, and things like pollution and contaminants and the growth and consumption patterns and whether that can be sustainable through time. And continuing on the headlines, just recently, many of you are aware of the new draft EPA regulations aimed at CO2 reduction. And it's interesting, I don't know if you read the newspaper here in Boulder, but they said that whether EPA came up with a single regulation or not, this was a done deal, just due to the built-in efficiencies of appliances, better use of electricity, some new alternative sources coming on the grid, such as solar or wind. And so analysis was made by people who do these analyses. I can't speak to the agency that would have done that, but they believe that that's fully going to happen, whether EPA comes out with a single regulation or not. And so whether whether Congress ever gets into the act of approving any other future legislation, it's probably going to happen anyway. So that's the good news. But then that consumption's taken up by other places in the world, and we're still polluting. Climate weather disasters in 2012. Again, these are headlines that just came out June 1st. $100 billion. And so, what are the strategies to predict whether you're an insurance company, whether you're an underwriter, whether you're a coastal resident, what this might mean for you, or you live out here in Boulder next to the Flatirons and a forest fire comes down and takes your house out. So we don't have to choose between a healthy economy and a healthy environment. That's one of the few quotes I really liked from Gina McCarthy. Makes sense. And then another headline was, our action will sharpen Americans' competitive edge, spur innovation, and create jobs. And that's a statement that President Obama made. And so what I'll do is cover real quick a rationale for big data ecological forecasting, because that's what we are. We're going to be a big data house. And our clients who receive that big data are probably going to be actively involved in ecological forecasting. An overview of some of the executive branch activities and how we play into working with them. And then some talk about the frontiers of the carbon cycle, with especially discussions of interoperability and socio-ecological systems. And so there's lots and lots and lots of data. So if you look at the time scale going from 2008 all the way out to 2013, you see the report to the President maintaining environmental capital and protecting society and the economy. The report to the President designing a digital future and federally funded research and developments in networking, so that's the IT, and then a national strategy for civil and Earth observations, which is one of the later documents that came out of the feds. And so lots and lots of data and a discussion of not only how the data needs to be managed, but also how that data might lead to new strategies for observing the Earth. And so if we talk about data as a national resource and you plug NEON into data as part of the national resource, then you see some of the statements that trail either proactive before NEON was formed or trail now what NEON's trying to accomplish. And you see some of the statements from Dr. Suresh's statements relative to this is the era of observations, the era of data and information. The March 12th White House $200 million big data initiative. And then there's all kinds of things internationally that all of us are playing with. I just found out you had a team down under. And certainly there's lots of things that we can play with our colleagues at other agencies. So, here's just NEON, and here's one of many big data centers such as the Kraken. And so we see global observations increasing in importance relative to support policy and decision making, but that is not going to happen without really, really good forecasting, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Global changes need global solutions, again from Suresh. And then now you're seeing how we come up with use case scenarios based upon societal benefit areas, and these are the societal benefit areas. And we just responded to an RFP that came out of the National Technology and Science area relative to, are these the correct SBAs to stand up in response to how we model ecosystems. And so the one SBA, which we don't see as a societal benefit area, is disasters. We don't see why disasters are a societal benefit area other than maybe mitigation of disasters. So we've responded to some of the SBAs. And then the importance of regional scales for heterogeneity, and questions of societal importance for these SBAs. And you'll see these areas of SBAs coming in several other places in the talk as I try to sort of couch what NEON's trying to accomplish. And so within ecological forecasting, we're aligning with ourselves with an established baseline. We need to do that now, and so we need to start at some point in time to pull all that together now. And then that puts us into a question and answer idea of cause and effect. And so remember that NEON was based upon developing the strategy to collect information to talk about change, ecological change, in a cause and effect way. And so then what is the most likely state of an ecological system? The question needs to be answered, provided an applied context of what if we make decisions today. So what if XYZ happens? That's a forecasting opportunity. And then the conceptual framework that can be applied to many ecosystems, and then how we design our applications and data products, and then get into the idea of interoperability, which is an area that certainly you guys are really keenly interested in. So let's go talk a little about this. You probably have seen this graph 100 times, but it's a really, really good use to talk about the percentage of 36-hour forecasting over the years and the percent of success in having that 36-hour forecasting, based on the idea that a theory was developed how best to do the forecasting, a model of forecast was developed, then the weather forecast came out, an analysis versus the forecast versus what really happened with the weather, back into observations, and it goes round and round and round. And so if you look at these years and how well our forecasting has grown up to better than 80%, there's no gigantic jumps in forecasting based on technology. Satellites came into here, weather airplanes, all kinds of different kinds of platforms on satellites, supercomputers, and it's based on the ability to take your forecast, test it against real conditions, modify the forecast with real data, and improve the forecast cycle. So you just look at all the different opportunities to have gigantic big data jumps in supercomputing power, in satellite imagery, and it's pretty much a straight line. And that's what's going to happen with NEON data too. It's going to take time, and that's why the NEON Observatory is being built for 30 years. So you could take any little small slice of NEON data, for a decade or for 5 years, but at the end of the day, is that forecast through time going to provide accuracy such that we can measure cause and effect and change, and the systems within that cause the cause and effect changes with that degree of capability. So the point is, you got to start somewhere with a forecast model, even if you're crapping out at 20% accuracy, which is about the accuracy I think we have in Boulder sometimes. I always wonder, you hear what's on the radio and you're like, that's not what it's doing in Boulder today, actually. So I always question how well our forecasting is in Boulder. But, you have to start someplace, and then you have to constantly spin the wheel. So how are we tied together with ecological forecasting, experiments, and observations, and how are we related? And I have to stress this. So NEON, somebody had to start now. So the suite of ecological data that we collect, the suite of ecological and atmospheric data that you guys collect, that others before us have collected, whether those are LTER kinds of programs, whether those are the carbon flux kinds of programs, somebody had to start at some point in time to get the ball rolling so that our observations and predictions could roll forward. So obviously there's a great need for NEON to start in the sphere of producing some ecological data and put that together centrally. So the specific processes, the things that are especially nonlinear and stochastic, you may not see those right away. You might develop a model and you don't, you're on the verge of a tipping point, and all of a sudden there's something that happens environmentally or in a cause and effect way, and all of a sudden the model, doesn't work very well. And an interesting thing was, coming from the Gulf Coast and after the oil spill, what didn't happen that was modeled to occur in the oil spill that never happened, relative to where the oil would wind up? Never wound up on the East Coast, right? Never hit the loop current and never made it around Florida in the loop current, right? So it got trapped in an eddy and stayed in the Gulf Coast the entire summer. So it barely touched Florida, right? Barely had a tiny impact on Florida, but stayed in the Gulf Coast the whole time. And all the models said that thing would be picked up by the loop current, flow on one side of Cuba, the other side of Cuba, come back together, make its way around Florida and up the East Coast, and it would be impacting on the East Coast beaches of Florida, right? Would come washing up on the East Coast beaches of Florida. Never occurred, right? So the best predictions didn't occur, and what happened was they didn't forecast what was going to get set up because the intense heat that summer set up an eddy current. And it was entirely surface temperature driven in the Gulf and wasn't driven by the normal modeling of what the water temperature was just prior at the time of the oil spill. So they didn't forecast that it was going to be just a brutally, brutally hot summer, and the oil never got out of the Gulf. And so these are the kinds of things for nonlinear, stochastic kinds of processes. Yeah, you can model what you think is going to happen, but it doesn't always come true. And at least in the case of the oil spill, most people are pretty glad that really glad that it didn't actually come true. And then you can go to estimates of steady states, information on process and parameters, experimenting with different kinds of studies with putting in your own parameters and testing unknowns, and then obviously using observations collectively with others or within your own construct of your space, your time, your sites, and trying to get your sites compared potentially to other sites to challenge the forecasts as an iterative process. So I didn't say this, but if anybody wants to interrupt me, just feel free to interrupt me. So talking about the writ large structure where we fit in the discussions at the federal level, we're part the same way that you're part of the OMB discussions, the OSTP, and the USGCRP memorandum discussions of where NEON fits in the big data sense of the kind of information it can provide in the decision-making process relative to global change research. So we can advance the understanding of vulnerabilities in human and biogeophysical systems, same way you guys do that. Relationships to climate extremes, thresholds and tipping points, integrated cross sector, biophysical, socioeconomic observations, and improved simulation modeling. So in the global change research area, these are the things that would drive their interest and our interest in collaborating with them. In the R&D and foreign policy making, obviously you have to have a strong R that leads to a D, which leads to some scientific basis of interpretation of what is going to happen to health, safety, and environmental impacts. A lot of interest now from all three of these entities in health and safety, and how information technology will allow the data to be not only interoperable with other entities that need that data, but also fully discoverable and fully accessible. And so we have to engineer our ability to provide data to the community in such a way that they would just download, like any researcher today would download Landsat data as part of their discovery tool, or use Google Earth tools as part of their geolocator kind of systems. So how would they download NEON data in the future in the same comfort way, that comfort factor and usability that they would to some of these other large databases that most other people use? And so, again, there's several themes that come out over and over and over again through OMB, OSTP, and USGCRP. Extremes, thresholds, and tipping points. Integrated research on coupling Earth and human systems. Again, the human health interest, which is huge. And this emerging integration of socioeconomic interests. And so we're seeing more entities come to NEON and say, well, have you considered the socioeconomic impacts of having an observatory? And our heretofore response to that was, well, we sort of thought about that, but what are you talking about that? And so getting on the same page as to the scientists and faculty members that look at socioeconomic change and how that's related to things that are going on relative to economic change based on environmental change is of great interest to them. And we have not barely scratched the surface of what those mutual interests might be, as it relates especially to research and decision support. And then theme 3 is the actionable science for informed policy making and management, obviously an area that OSTP is seriously interested in. And so if you look at, who are the players, here's just a kaleidoscope of some of the players that would lead to this initiative that is likely to be strongly based in the Boulder area, which is the Future Earth initiative. Many of us in the room have had a role in talking about Future Earth and deciding where our individual research or where our program research might fit into the Future Earth framework. And obviously it's being looked at from everything from ISSC to the UN to UNEP and all the way around the Belmont Forum, et cetera. So this is an area that provides great opportunity to have the dialogue, and then after we have that dialogue and a common understanding, then that's likely to form the cast-off groups that will go out and do the work and analyze the data that would lead to this idea of global sustainability, or at least things of producing data quality sufficient enough to support policy analysis and social science initiatives. So just an idea of sort of the time framework of where these things have come from. And you could see the time scale of WCRP to Diversitas, and these are all familiar to you guys, probably more so than anybody else we would present to with WCRP and coming to this initiative that looks like it might be strongly housed in the Colorado region with some input from other collaborators. So we're looking forward to what Future Earth might bring and discussions with our colleagues both here and abroad as to what we might be able to do. So that's one area where we can strongly meet in the middle and collaborate on. And then other things that National Science Foundation did, which was really, really clever, is they set up our user community, so let's call them our super users, our NEON super user community, to actually start thinking about cause and effect and feedback in their proposal writing in anticipation of NEON coming on board. And so there was a concerted effort to get our scientists working collaboratively, at least in the bio directorate, to be able to respond to this macro systems RFP. And so it's been very, very successful in looking at things that normally wouldn't have been a mere hypothesis testing with one faculty member, a couple postdocs, and a grad student kind of thing, and getting it more largely based across a macro systems concept. So that was really, really clever. Proposals are getting written right now saying we're going to use NEON data. And as you know, if you've been to our portal lately, we only have about that much data coming out of the NEON portal. So it's gratifying, but it's also a little bit scary to know what the demand is going to be from the user community for the NEON data when it finally shows up. And then CZOs, we actually have one on the front range here, which is the same kind of geobiophysical processes, looking at the entire life zone and how that relates from bedrock to the atmosphere. And then the macro systems program, which is PI driven and takes in the entire hydrosphere. So let me walk you through this. We showed this to PCAST, President's Council Advisors of Science and Technology. So we had a meeting with them earlier in the year, and they wanted to know how NEON would play into policy. And at what point would NEON data, in this 30-year run of providing big data to the community, where NEON would play in that. And so if we start, I'm going to move away from the camera now. So if we start how NEON was built, which was through science requirements and saying, okay, what are the grand challenge questions? What is the science that has to be built for that? What are the sensors that have to be stood up? What is the biological sampling that has to take place? And come up with the science requirements, then you take those science requirements and you turn them into data products. So there's some ATBDs that have to get written, they have to collect all this data, and you stick it out there into a big data repository for the user community. And so now you go into your traceability, you know where the measurements came from, you're able to put them up, and you essentially take your experimental observational data and now start pushing it towards the community through tools such as informatics. And so if people say, well, I'm supporting a big data facility and they're not talking informatics, then our question is how you're supporting a big data facility if you're not talking about informatics, how you manage that and how you talk to others that are producing equivalent data centers. And then out of this, then either through discovery with scientists or through the private sector, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Weather Corporation, those kinds of entities, then they may come up with tools and collaborations for transforming this information into high-order data products, potentially. Okay. And then you still have informatics, which is cyber interoperability. And what's talked about now through PCAST is to have the equivalent of like a ticker tape. How's the Dow Jones doing? How's the stock market doing? And what they want is an environmental ticker tape of X number of key factors that can be measured and understood by policymakers as to the status of the environment today. So how are we doing today in the environment? So what's the ticker tape measurement that would be provided to the bean counting measurement that would be provided to policymakers to know how we're doing? And so if you read USGCRP's near-term objectives, it's to go to this sort of model, which is environmental indicators. And what are those? What's the complete sum of environmental indicators that might be potentially used? And then once we have an understanding of the long-term effects of these environmental indicators, then you get the publications and the educational resources, which goes into the SBAs, everything from ecosystems down to weather. That gets transformed into publications and training modules and all of that. And then you go into resource management with the idea of having risk, vulnerability, climate adaptation, education as key components that support the societal benefit areas. So what we did was we presented this idea of you started with science requirements and you moved all the way through these environmental indicators into publications and training, and eventually people are able to transform their understanding of where we are with the environment and where the environment is today relative to our resource management or any one of the societal benefit areas. So that was the best way that we could map it really quick for them so that they may get an understanding. And that really sold well. So it looks like a really, really busy diagram, but when we went through it with them really quick, they got it. And we just recently represented this to the council that serves USGCRP, which is the Science Technology Council, on Friday. And that went over pretty well also on Friday. Yeah.
Could you help me understand environmental indicators by giving a few examples? That seems extremely hard to define and controversial.
I don't have any because they haven't, maybe it's what's the CO2 concentration today in the atmosphere? Even though we know it's doing this thing, at what time you're collecting it, at night, day, so maybe there's some cumulative number that people would look at as, the ozone, so you see the pollen thing on a daily basis, it's yellow, green, red for pollen or particulates. That's an environmental indicator, right? So how many things go into your pollen indicator? How many measurements does it take to come up with whether you need to wear a mask today in Beijing or you don't need to wear a mask in Beijing today? I'm not your best scientist to ask that question of, but these are things that are all on the table right now. So when you look at the next workings of the USGCRP, you're going to see a strong propensity for them to start narrowing down, either combining environmental parameters or coming up with a thought of what these things might be and have a common set. So that's the talk when we sit in meetings that they're going through. Because, they're losing. If you go big data and you go to informatics and you say, well, the data's out there, just go find it. There's not a policy person that's going to be able to find it. There's not a U.S. public that's going to be able to find it, especially if they're talking about how does that big data relate to societal benefit areas. It has to get translated at some point in time. And so that's sort of like the translation part of how does some of that get put down into components that people would understand. And then the frontiers of interoperability. So we operate in all of these areas. ANI, just so you know, is Analysis for Experimentation on Ecosystems, which is out of France. TERN is Australia, Terrestrial Ecological Research Network. LifeWatch is about biodiversity. ICOS you're familiar with. Carbon Flux and out of Mexico and Canada. Korea, KION, China, CERN, ILTRs, which is global, and all these areas that we currently are collaborating with that were either came out of science and came up from the bottom into something where scientists self-organized, or things that were actually set up by governments or larger entities, like agencies and governments. And so we're actually operating with all of them. And so if we're going to have this interoperability philosophy with all of these different players, then we need to link science questions to the hypotheses and requirements, and that's the way NEON was founded. What must be done, what should we do, defining science scope, etc. And if you're going to start measuring things, then you need to have a traceability matrix to be able to use best practice with standards. And then that leads to collecting the data. Once you get the data collected, then what is the algorithm used to transform that data into usable data products? And then, as I said earlier, then you get the data products and you better start considering informatics. So what's the syntax? What are the definitions? How do you make your data available, explorable, and ontologies and semantics? And so how do people get into your data and are able to use your data as they compare it to their databases? And so we have a lot of discussions right now in this area in how we take our data and make sure that it's discoverable by the community. And the one area we don't have any strength in right now is informatics. So, we're having a lot of this activity right now in NEON, and we got to move really quickly into this area. And we're pretty short-handed in this area right now. And so you're seeing things on our website that relate to hiring people that'll be helping us strategize in this area. And so this is where NEON operates. And so we have lots of activities. I don't have to read all those things, everything from steering committees to meetings over and over again with all of these folks. And because of that, we were asked by NSF GEO to lead the Cooperative project. And so what that was taking all of Europe's observatories and comparing them one-to-one with all of NSF's U.S.-based observatories. And so we have everything from carbon modeling to biodiversity to space weather to oceans and plate tectonics. And so you can see the work packages defined in between. So there's a U.S. steering committee with a project coordinator. There's the EU steering committee with a project. This is funded out of NSF GEO, and we're the U.S. partner that manages this part of the U.S. organization. So that's the U.S. governance and management of the work packages across to our counterparts. So if you look at this, it's really a ladder. You have a rail on this side, you have a rail on that side, and where funding comes together, or where a plan comes together, which is the rungs, then those work packages start getting worked on. So what's going on now is the definition of the work package and how to get it done. The next strategy is to start finding the money to fund those work packages. And so when you hear NEON folks talking about their involvement with Cooperative, it's against the carbon budget folks and against the biodiversity counterparts in the EU. And then interoperability philosophy, which is becoming web brokering, and I think you folks are involved with many of these initiatives, and we are likewise. And so discussions are always going on as, can you serve on this panel, can you serve on this advisory group relative to everything from EarthCube, which is NSF GEO, to the Research Data Alliance group on Earth observations. And I think you folks play in all those, if I'm not mistaken, from your side. And the emerging area of great interest is what I said earlier, which is the socio-ecological systems as it relates to vulnerability assessments. And we're seeing our role increase in participating in a lot of the workshops, saying, okay, well, what is this ecological data going to do for social science observatories? And they're actually calling them social science observatories, which means they're going to use our data to come up with social science questions and hypotheses in the area of cause and effect, and how does that relate to an understanding of how they make decision making with the scientific products that come from us. And so how do we talk to these folks, and how do we integrate with social science systems? This is where we're starting, is what do they need to measure that we're measuring? Are we measuring the things that they need us to measure? Not that we're going to alter all our protocols, but are we compatible in that area? And do they scale based on our disciplines and other disciplines? And so they're very interested, obviously, in societal impacts and societal importance. So just real quickly to finish up then, what are the specific impediments that we're beginning to find that thwart us in this area? Science versus social science, you see that controversy playing out in Congress all the time, let alone, between scientist to scientist. Differential reward systems, expectations of what we should do and how we should do that, the nature of what we can do, the tendency of the groups to diversify and come up with something different when you are only doing one thing, like the social scientists telling NEON that we need to do this now and this now and this now when we already got a set of requirements where we're not going to change course instantaneously, and a lack of acceptance of the value of different knowledge systems. So my science is better than your science kind of thing. And then more specifically for scientists, how we communicate risk and uncertainty cannot necessarily be understood by the public. And so we talk about that all the time, the risk and uncertainty of our measurements and the traceability matrix of how we got to where we're measuring against the grand challenge question. So that's the requirements coming from the bottom back up to the requirements and the grand challenges. And when we start talking about uncertainty, people shut down. It's like, I don't know what you're talking about in the area of uncertainty. You're providing me the data, that's it, isn't it? No, that comes with an uncertainty budget, and that comes with error, signal to noise, and we can give you all that information as you use it in your modeling. And as we have those discussions with social scientists, there's some sort of tension. So the million-dollar question is, how would we operate and interact with you guys? And so there's three parts of NEON. One is the advisory parts of NEON, and so we have the Science, Technology, Education Committee, which is a group of scientists that feed in between the NEON Board of Directors and my office. So they're an advisory group of scientists established by a committee, self-appointing, that provide input scientifically in the NEON. And they can talk up to the board of directors, and they can talk down to me. There's the National Science Foundation providing two funding elements now. The rRNA account, which is the operational part. That's that $111 million 3-year award that's to come pretty soon in the next couple months. And then the MREFC account, which is the large facilities account, which is the $434 million account. So they're the two awards coming from National Science Foundation. And then we come down with how that's managed, the two awards. One is a project manager with a project scientist designing the NEON construction project. The rRNA account goes into the observatory director's office to operate the observatory. And what will happen is these things will be running in parallel for a period of years as we're finishing building out the construction project and beginning to try our hand at actually operating NEON as an operable observatory. And so these things will be operating in tandem, and you can see the things that will automatically start dropping into observations, such as our Cal-Val lab and our aerial operations and those kinds of things. That makes sense, in our educational training things. Then there's this other part of the Neon 501c3, which is the scientific community interacting with Neon Inc., saying, you guys got some unique capabilities and you got some skills. Could I do something collaboratively with you? And that may come with a different color of money. It may come from a different agency. It may come from a foreign government. It may come from a proposal writing process. And can we work with Neon to do X, Y, Z? And that comes on the Inc. side outside of the NSF side. Okay, so that comes down into a strategic project managed by Neon Inc., which is outside of Neon the project. And Neon the project, again, having two parts, the construction project and the operations project. And so we have Neon satellite sites, interoperability, experiments, infrastructure. The Cooperative project, for example, is a good example of that, and on and on. So we have other sponsored activities, just like you guys have external sponsored activities, and that comes down under a strategic project side. So moving forward, we're going to get more interdisciplinary, more international. We're hopeful that there's more political will. We need to start co-designing with users and funders and try to get to solution-based activities. And so if we're going to meet the challenge of global environmental change, it just requires a better approach. And I already talked about this, the drivers and the pathways to sustainability and the drivers of the cause and effect. And so I'll finish with questions.
Questions for Russ?
I could hear you, probably. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're recording. Sorry.
What fraction of your budget is distributed by providing data services, data collection, QC, and dissemination versus all the other activities you described, facilitating research, community service, et cetera?
Okay. So right now we're absolutely inverted as to how a corporation would be funded. So normal funding for corporations is about 60% is going to be personnel. You're going to have about 20% in indirect support, another 20% if you're a big data center probably for running your data center and all that, and then another percentage going across other activities. So Neon's totally inverted right now. So we're a construction project. 60% of everything we spend $1 on is infrastructure right now. Okay, and then as we go towards out of the infrastructure and into operations, more and more and more funding will be directed towards the data center, towards becoming a big data provider, right? So we haven't even gotten there yet. Everything right now is still on the construction side of the house and not considered to be operations. And so it's just a drop in the bucket financially compared to the infrastructure costs of building Neon right now. So it's a few percentage. Because the burn rate right now for Neon is well over $100 million a year. That's where we are right now. So, could be $120 million a year burn rate. And so you say, well, how much of that's in our data center? So, you look at maybe 15 people in a server room. That's that much.
Just to follow up, as I'm trying to understand more about the organization, what are the primary activities that are included in your infrastructure development project? So these are global observing site installations, or is it headquarters type based building, computer rooms? What is it made up of?
Okay, so Neon is continental scale, U.S. continental scale. So it's not Canada, it's not Mexico, but it's U.S. And so we have facilities, and we have 106 sites. From Alaska to Hawaii, across the United States, and Puerto Rico. And so those 106 sites, 96 of those sites are both aquatic and terrestrial monitoring systems, and then a small experimental unit with water quality testing to round out the 106 sites. And so that is a distributed location in 20 domains of the United States. And within each of those domains, we have 3 flux towers and usually aquatic sites. And the 3 flux towers, one will be considered the baseline flux tower, and the other 2 will be considered to be relocatable, even though it's a gigantic steel tower that might be, 40 meters tall. It's still considered relocatable. So it's potentially programmed there for anywhere from 8 to 15 years, and then the whole thing could be picked up and reassembled somewhere else, either in that domain or another domain. But to start with, there's 20 domains, 3 flux towers, a full soil array of instrumentation at the base of each of those flux towers, a sampling of biological parameters, observational parameters. So the abiotic is the soil in the tower, and then you have the biotic parameters, which is sentinel species and vegetation analysis. And then the flyover with our aerial package, which is LiDAR, spectrometry, and high-resolution HD photography. And so, and we'll have 3 aerial platforms with that being flown, each one of those domains at least scheduled for every other year of the domain sites. And so what we're going to try to do is to go to a level of capability rather than how much have we completed of the NEON infrastructure. And so by next June, we should be 25% complete as an observatory, and then we'll be 60% complete as an observatory, and then eventually in September 2017, we should be 100% complete as an observatory. So we're doing percent completion rather than, well, we have X amount of sites up and running, data streaming back to NEON, without ever saying where we are with the observatory. And so now we're metricizing the level of completeness in all aspects of the observatory. So infrastructure, civil construction might be 60% complete when we're only saying that we're 25% complete as an observatory, because we have to have all elements, data and all the infrastructure for those 25, all functioning and all working well, even though some things may be much more complete in the project. And so we're taking a percent of capability as our strategy to present to the community and to NSF. And that seems to be working better than talking about how much we built. It's not impressive to talk about how much we built. It's better to say we have 25% capability and the entire East Coast is now operating. The entire East Coast, all 3 domains on the East Coast are operating, which is more important because now people can start writing science projects against the data streaming from an entire East Coast observatory, where you could start looking at trends up and down the East Coast, rather than saying, well, we have a bunch of sites that are ready, go use the sites that are ready. So it's a little bit different strategy. Seems to be playing well.
On the funding side, I'm wondering how well funded your science users are. Are they being? Do you find you'd like more, or you have too many, or?
Well, again, it's a huge issue of expectation. So, if we do a lot of arm waving on the NEON side, then everybody says, all right, we're ready, and then you don't have the data to support it. And then, and so you get out of sync with a proposal getting written to say macro systems that's supposedly going to use NEON data in this domain, and then the domain data doesn't show up. And so you just got a whole group of scientists excited to submit a successful proposal, and the data's not there. So we have to be very cautious about our cause and effect of impact of getting people too advanced in their wanting to use NEON as a platform to test our hypotheses and to pull data out of NEON without being prepared. And so a lot of times I'm trying to direct scientists to what I would call observatory science. So take our LiDAR data, for example, or our spectrometry data, and compare it to other data sets for that area, or a scaling exercise between us and a Aspiri flight. And how does our data compare to something at a different level or at a different scale where we have the database to support that. So it's the expectation piece is an important issue, and one we you can't do a lot of arm waving without getting everybody excited, and then if we get them too excited, we're going to let them down. You let the community down one time, it's like the first impression. You got one chance at that before people get really discouraged. Say, neon's just a bunch of hooey and vapor. So we don't want to be a vapor observatory. You want to be able to support the teams that need the data when they think it's going to be there.
Early on, I noticed in your list of agencies, you didn't mention NASA. I wonder, do you foresee interaction with some of the space-based observations?
Yeah, eventually. There's a lot of observation out of space right now that everybody uses, certainly as we use it for geolocation and imagery. But there is going to be some flights. So the Spiri flight, that flight that's scheduled, I think it's 2017 now, it's scheduled, is going to be flying our same exact spectrometer. We have 3 of them. They'll be flying one of them, and so we could start doing the scaling experiments with that. So a similar instrument was flown over our domain in California back last year, and so we had people on the ground measuring ground-based data. We had our airplane flying low and slow about 1 kilometer up, and then we had the spy plane flying up about 60,000 feet. And measuring all the same thing at the same time. And so that'll be a unique science paper that'll be coming out from a NEON NASA team comparing notes on how well the spectrometers scale. But those kinds of experiments make sense at this point in time. And then, in the future when there are things that are looking at synoptic measurements that where we're flying something, there's an observation from space, I think the scaling possibilities for interoperability are going to be really fantastic. We're really looking forward to that. And even just imagery, people aren't that excited about high definition imagery, but there's a lot of things that you can see on HD that you're not going to see with LiDAR, you're not going to see with your spectrometers. So like we flew the Hyde Park fire, you can't see the individual stems that are standing there, that are charred and burned. But the high def photography shows every single stem that's standing out there, but we're not picking it up on LiDAR because, as you're shooting straight down, you're barely getting any return from a pole, right? Because it doesn't have branches and all the structure that it would normally have as a tree not burned. So there's some interesting things that you could just do with HD photography that's not getting done by the community because it's not particularly sexy, but I think it will be sexy as you start using it as another database, especially things like on the Hyde Park fire, which we've flown twice, by the way. So we flew it right after it burned, and we flew it again this past fall. So we have two years of flying over it. And we flew Boulder Creek just before the flood. So now FEMA's using our data to see what are the comparisons for filling in the creek bottom and where a lot of sediment was moved and the depressional areas that got filled in with sediment and rocks and boulders compared to what we imaged prior to the flood. So again, our data is being used in a pilot way, which is kind of unique. So, as the data set starts growing and we get better at presenting the data, I think the community will start coming along to use it. But thanks for the question.
Some people have to get to cars and shuttles and things, so I think we'll close, but if we can continue on afterwards if other people have further questions.
Thank you.
Let's thank Russ again.